stitch width and stitch length. What is the difference? Now, if you're a beginner, those two buttons can be really confusing, and knowing which one to press for what particular outcome, or which dial to turn depending on what kind of machine you have. So let me explain to you what the difference is and which buttons you need to push to adjust the both and why you might need to adjust them. So I am Kim, this is Quilt with Kim. You are very, very welcome here. I'm going to switch camera so we can go and have a look. No fabric, just a piece of paper for this one. I will pop over to my machine in a minute and show you the buttons. But let's explain the difference first. Your stitch length, as the name suggests, tells you how long your stitches are. So when you're making a stitch line or you're sewing two pieces of fabric together, your stitches need to be a certain length to make that seam nice and secure. Normally that stitch length is 2.5. You'll see that on your machine. You'll see a dial or some buttons that tend to go from 0 up to, it could be 5 or it could be 7. It just depends. Sorry, that's off the top of the screen. It just depends on what machine you've got as to where it goes up to. This number relates to millimeters. So that is how long your stitch length is. I've got a whole video which explains stitch lengths in quite a lot of detail. So I'll put the link to that right at the end of this video, and I'll also pop it down here so you can go and take a look at that and gen up on your stitch length. So that's how long your stitches are. So the smaller this number is, the smaller and tighter your stitches are, and the longer that is, or the bigger the number, the longer your stitches are. So if I had the opportunity to go up to 7 on my machine, 7 mils is obviously longer than 2.5 mils, so you might have that as a stitch length. Sometimes you need that as a stitch length. This is not the video to explain all the reasons why you might need longer stitch length. So watch that video on stitch length and I've explained all in there. But that's your stitch length. Now your stitch width shows how far apart the needle swings when you're doing zigzags. Particularly some of the other decorative stitches as well, but let's stick to just the zigzags. So you will have a zigzag, and a zigzag goes like that. Okay, we know that. So my little dots there to show where the needle goes in. So as you're stitching, it'll make that shape of a zigzag. Let's just say I want a wide zigzag, and this is where my stitch width comes in. My zigzags might go like that. So this is my stitch width. Now normally your machine will have a default stitch width. On my machine it's actually 3.5. So that's 3.5 millimeters from the edge of this stitch from that side to that side. If I increased my stitch width to, let's just say 6 or 5, depending on where your machine goes up to, that means from here to here would be 5 millimeters. Just as much as if I took it to, let's just say 2 millimeters, my zigzag is going to be very small. Can you see? So your stitch width shows how far apart or how wide your zigzags are. Now where it gets a bit confusing, let's just say you want, let's come over here to another clean bit of paper. Let's just say you want a standard stitch width of 3.5, but you want these stitches closer together. That's where you would keep this at your 3.5, say, but you would lower your stitch length. And if you did that, remember this is the distance between the stitches. If you did that, you'd end up with something that looked like that, depending on where you set your stitch length to. So it would be the same length of your zigzag, but they would be closer together. If you increased your stitch length, let's just say we had 7, for example, and I still was keeping to my 3.5. If I had my 3.5, so that's the same width, but I now have 7, it would be something like that. Look, this is a quilting channel. I did not ever say I could draw. But you get the point that my zigzags are going to be really far apart. Okay, so can you see how by adjusting one or the other, you'll get an entirely different look. If you wanted to do satin stitching, for example, now satin stitching is when you get very close stitching, and we use it normally on the edge of a plique. But if you want satin stitching, you need quite a small zigzag, but you need them close together as well. So what do you think we need to do? Yeah, we need to decrease our stitch width. So we might have, let's just say a 2mm stitch width, and we want our stitch length to be really low, so maybe 0.1 or 0.5, just depending on where your machine goes to, and then that'll put the zigzags really really close together. I'm trying to demonstrate this so you can see. All right, so can you see how it completely changes the look and the feel of your zigzags just by changing either the stitch width or your stitch length. Okay, so stitch length stretches it out or it pushes it together again. Your stitch width makes it teeny tiny narrow or stretches it, it goes really wide on your on your fabric. So let's have a look at where you're looking on your machine for that. But look at this bit of paper, because we've got a bit of a clue in this. We are looking at this dashed line for our stitch length, and we're looking for a zigzag symbol for your stitch width. So I'm going to show you my machine, but I've got a computerized machine. So my symbols are in a little window, in a little LCD display. Yours might be on dials on your machine, on the top of your machine. It just depends on the machine, but the symbols are the same. So here we are at my LCD display of my machine. Don't worry if you haven't got a computerized machine, because the symbols are exactly the same if you've got a mechanical machine and you've got dials just on the top of your machine. That's where they normally are. So at the moment my machine is set for just a normal straight stitch, and you can see here we've got 3 symbols. We've got this one on the left here, which is like a little X's joined up together. That is my tension. I do not need to change that button at all. Okay. Over on the right here, to the right of that, we've got a zigzag symbol. That zigzag symbol shows you how to adjust your stitch width. All right. So if you've got a mechanical machine with a dial, look for the dial that has that little zigzag symbol next to it, or in front of it, or just behind it. And you will see that that dial goes from 0 probably up to about 5. For a straight stitch, you want it on your 0, just like my machine has defaulted to here. So put that dial down to 0 if you're straight stitching. And you can obviously change that. Do you remember we spoke about how wide we might want our zigzags? We can adjust that accordingly as to how wide we want our zigzags, but I'll show you a little bit on that in a minute. So the zigzag symbol is your stitch width. If we go over here, we can see that little running line there. Sorry, I keep knocking my camera. That running line there, that dashed line, that is the symbol for your stitch length. So you can see here it's defaulting to 2.5 because I want a standard straight stitch in this particular instance. So your dash line, if you've got a mechanical machine, have a look at the dial with a little dashed line, and it goes from a small little dash up to a longer dash. That will tell you how to adjust your stitch width. So if you want to do a straight stitch, a straight seam, put your dial to 2.5. So normally the 2.5 isn't shown on the dial, so just put it between 2 and 3. That'll be absolutely fine. Okay, so that's your straight stitch. Now look what happens when I change my machine to a zigzag. And you can see how these things change. So the tension hasn't changed at all. So that tells me that I don't need to touch my tension on any machine. But can you see here the zigzag? So my stitch width has changed to 3.5. So that's what will happen when I do a standard a standard zigzag. That will be 3.5 mils wide, and this is defaulted to 1.4 or 1.5 mil for its stitch length. That's how far apart it will want the zigzags to be. So let me show you on the machine what happens when I stitch with those figures, and then what happens when I change one or both of them. Let's have a little play. Here we are then, all ready to stitch. Now I've got an open toe foot on my machine ready for a zigzag. If your machine has an open toe and your manual says use the open toe foot, then use the open toe foot. That's because your zigzag stitches go from left to right, and you need the hole big enough to take the zigzag. But if your machine says just use your normal foot, then just use your normal foot. So my foot is down and my settings are just on that standard zigzag that I was just showing you 1 second ago. So I'm going to slow the speed down because it's on Speedy Gonzales level. And let me just show you this very basic zigzag. So this is the 3.5 mil stitch width and 1.4 mil apart. So that's what that's doing there. So let's just take that out and show you. So that's what it wants as its standard zigzag. Okay, so we've got 3.5 that way, 1.5 between those little points where the needle goes in. Just trying to show you with my left hand, which is not easy. So let's see what happens if I put my stitch length. I'm putting my stitch length up to 4 just to be a bit ridiculous and see what happens there. So if I put that down, and we'll see what happens. So I haven't changed the stitch width. The stitch width is still 3.5, but I've changed my stitch length. Remember, that's how long they are. So if I get this a minute, how far apart the zigzags are. This is really difficult to show you just here. We'll ditch that. That's not working. So we've got a stitch width of 3.5. It's all going to pot, isn't it? And a stitch length of 4. Let's see what happens. Oh, can you see how that's changed? How my zigzag looks. Can you see how different that is? And that's not a great look. But let's see what happens if I start changing my stitch width. So I'm going to put my stitch width up to, what should I do? I'm going to put my stitch width to 6.5. So my stitch width is 6.5. So that'll make this part of the zigzag wider, but my 4 should be about the same as this. So let's see what happens. Can you see how different that looks already? Can you see how that needle is swinging from left to right? Okay, so we've got our distance between the zigzags is actually the same as here, but because we've made our stitch width bigger or longer, we've got a bigger zigzag, but actually that looks a lot better and more in proportion. So it really depends on what we're doing. If I wanted something decorative, I might want that, but if I was trying to stop the edges of my fabric from fraying, I'd probably want something quite small like this. Let's go the other way and reduce so that we're going to keep this the same. We're going to keep this as 6.5, but I'm reducing my stitch length to, what am I going to put that down to? 1.2, that's where that is. So this will be the same width, but it will be really narrow together. Sorry, my foot pedal keeps disappearing under the cabinet that's underneath. Okay, so can you see? Let's just speed that up a little bit. Can you see? The machine didn't like that at all. Didn't like that at all. But can you see how close these are together now? So that's changing the stitch length. The reason why I didn't like it is because I went a bit too fast and I haven't got any stabilizer on the back of this. That's another subject for another time. For now though, know that if you're changing your stitch width, that changes this bit here, the length of the zig and the zag. Which is the zig and which is the zag? Do we know that? Is this a question for life? So your stitch width is how wide that zigzag is, and your stitch length is how far apart those zigzags are. Okay, so that was 1.4, that's its standard. That was, I can't even remember what that was anymore. So that was 4, wasn't it? That was separated out. That was 4, but we now made the zigzag bigger, so the length was increased and the width was increased. And this one, we kept the width quite large at 6.5, but we reduced the stitch length. Do you see how all that can change the dynamics of your zigzag and how you can utilize those in different ways on your machine? So I encourage you to grab yourself some spare fabric, always sew through at least 2 layers, have a little play and see what happens when you are changing one thing at a time, and see what happens to your stitching. So play with your stitch length, play with the stitch width, and see what happens with your zigzags. And you can use them decoratively or you can use them as a utility stitch to stop edges fraying. However you choose to use them, I hope this video has helped. If you've got any questions at all, please pop them below here. I do answer all the questions. Even if it takes me a day or two, I will try and get to all the questions to answer. So please don't be afraid to ask. I do answer them for you. I hope this has been helpful, and I will really look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.